Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Conversations from Stritch. I'm Dave Livingston, president of Lewis University, and I'm joined today by Dr. Christopher Sint, our provost. Today we're going to take a little deeper dive into the coronavirus and the public health issues that surround the pandemic that we're facing as a world. Before we do that, I wanted to wish all of you a belated happy 4th of July. I hope you enjoyed time with friends and family. We are seeing a bit more activity on campus with our flight students taking off and some of our students doing some summer undergraduate research. But it still remains pretty quiet here. But Chris and I are glad to be back on campus and back with you this afternoon. Before we get started with our two guests that Chris will introduce today, we have been receiving a few questions, more about the general stuff that we keep coming back to. What's it going to be like in the fall? How are we responding to the COVID crisis? And I want to reemphasize, which I've said I think every week, and Dr. Sint has reemphasized that we will consistently be balancing the public health of our whole community and keeping everyone safe, our employees and our students, with the desire to have a hybrid model of education in which students have access to their professors and also are able to learn in an online and hybrid way. So I guess I'd just like, Chris, maybe you could just talk a little bit about what's been going on over the last couple weeks in terms of the teams that you work with. Dr. Sint manages most of the kind of conversations that are going on with multiple teams on campus. So just kind of the response to how things are going in preparing ourselves for 7 weeks, I think, from now when we actually return to the classroom.
Yeah, that sounds like really soon. Hello, everyone. Great to be here with you. And so we do want to get pretty quickly to our focus today, but I just wanted to say a couple things. We are deep in the middle of so much work in preparation for the fall semester, and we're really excited to kind of bring some projects to fruition around the whole range of things, from preparing classrooms to finalizing the schedule and the calendar for the fall semester, as well as student activities and residence halls and athletics and many of the things we've talked about here in previous weeks. And I just wanted to reiterate that we know that I've been talking with a lot of different groups, student groups, as well as employees at Lewis, and there is just a great amount of support and enthusiasm for preparing for the fall, and a great need for people to just be able to imagine what their own life is going to be like in the fall, whether that be moving into the residence halls, eating, going to class, teaching a class, and all those things. We're very aware that people want to start visualizing how it's going to be for them in a more concrete and specific way. So I would just, as we bring some of this planning to culmination, we will be communicating in a lot of different ways to groups about what exactly life is going to be like, and we're planning on doing a lot of that with video. But also, I just want to announce today, and I'll put this in an email going out tonight or tomorrow morning, that we have revamped our Return to Campus website, and it's now live as of about half an hour ago or so. So please check that out now or today, when we're not after Nancy and Jim are done, and then also keep returning to it, because it's going to keep getting built up with a lot more resources for people in the community to, as I said, visualize how we are planning. And in addition to what Dr. Livingston said, we're continuing to just really closely monitor the guidance we're getting, and our guests may talk about this, but from the Illinois Board of Higher Education, the CDC, and the Illinois Department of Public Health, all continuing to give us guidance, and we're following that. This week, we're particularly interested also in guidance from the Department of Homeland Security around international students entering the campus and studying, and we're monitoring that and working very closely with our international student population in finding a way for them to transition into the country and into studying at Lewis. And we're also, from a little bit more distance perspective, very closely monitoring what's going on nationally around athletics and speaking with our league representatives and the NCAA around any new guidance that might be coming our way via those authorities. So
Just a quick comment on that. I think that what we want to do is just re-emphasize as one more thing that we said so many times is that this is a very fluid environment, and I'm sure we'll hear from Jim and Nancy that that is common to public health crises because things shift and change, and we're not in charge of how the virus behaves or how all human beings, either in our state or in our county. So, as Chris was saying, what we're going to keep doing is to react to, prepare for, and do scenario planning around the things that could change, but also be, kind of humble enough to know that we don't know everything, and we're going to take seriously those kind of two things, educational excellence and the health of our community, and keep those at the foreground in every decision we make and as we plan. But there have been things this week, Chris mentioned 3 of them, that have changed in the last 3 days, and we will continue to respond to those. So without any more on that, we just wanted to start with that. I'll ask Chris to introduce our guests, which we're really excited to have.
Okay, great. So we're so excited to welcome Dr. Nanci Reiland from the Department of Nursing, the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, and Dr. James Rago from the Department of Biology and the College of Aviation Science and Technology, who are here today. And as we talked about already, it's a little bit different format. We've really asked them to come and share their knowledge of the virus and of its community impact as professors, as researchers and scholars, so that as a kind of service to us and the community, the Lewis community, to learn from our professors and to be able to have a little bit of context or deeper knowledge around this. So we're going to talk a little bit about Lewis and our preparations, and more about just simply learning from our wonderful faculty. So I believe, Jim, you are going to go first, but so welcome to Jim and Nancy. It's so great to have you here and to be able to see you and hear from you.
Yeah, and thank you, Jim, for joining us today.
Oh, you're
not only having us, but for all the thoughtful, good work you've put into getting the campus up to speed for the fall. I can only imagine what a Herculean task that must be. So thank you both and your staff very much.
Thank you, Jim.
So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about just some virus specifics and some COVID specifics. And then I'm going to hand it over to Nancy, and she's going to talk more a little bit about epidemiology and how the virus behaves in populations of humans, and what we know now and what we think we know now and what we don't yet know. So we have okay. So really, really basically, viruses technically aren't true life forms. They're kind of quasi-life forms. They don't quite meet the definition of a true life form for several reasons. First of all, they're not made of a cell or cells, as life forms are. They don't have both kinds of nucleic acids. They either have one or the other. So they either have DNA or RNA, not both. And probably the biggest damning thing against them is they don't have their own metabolism. If you think about a computer virus is a invasive program that gets into your computer and basically superimposes itself over the other programs, and basically says to the computer, you're not going to run these programs you're interested in running right now. You're going to run me, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. And that's essentially what a virus does. Its nucleic acid core, you can say, in the center of these pictures, I keep trying to use my little arrow pointer here, realizing you probably can't see that. So the nucleic acid core is kind of the important part of the virus that superimposes itself over the messages that the cell is trying to use to carry out its basic functions. So essentially, the cell is forced to do what the virus tells it to do and make what the virus tells it to make. And they're specific to certain cells. I'll talk a little bit more about interactions between these spike proteins you can kind of see and receptors found on host cells. But that's how a virus picks what kind of cells that it wants to infect. It's usually, like I said, very picky about that. And there are several reasons for that I'll get into a little more detail with in just a bit. But structurally speaking, viruses typically only have two main parts, and many of them have a third part. If you look on the left of this picture here, you can see what they sometimes call a naked virus. A naked virus has that nucleic acid core, that really important part of the virus, and it's got a protein shell called a capsid. Now, there are some viruses that just exist with those two basic parts. Several of clinical significance to humans would be things like hepatitis A, rhinoviruses, which cause most common colds, hepatitis A, several others. But on the right there, you can see what's called an envelope virus. Many viruses, in fact, I would guess most viruses of human significance have an envelope. They have a sphere of membrane that the virus took with them when the virus left. And that envelope oftentimes has these spike proteins embedded in it, which are important in the key attaching to a host cell process. Next slide. What you can kind of see here is a representation of what cells do in response to being invaded by viruses. If you look on the left, you can see a cell that has been infected with a virus. That cell on the left is basically screwed. It is going to die because of the viral infection. But with kind of its last gasp, dying breath, one of the things, or a couple of things it does to help out the rest of the body is, first of all, it can make something called interferon. That interferon is secreted by the infected cell. It binds to healthy cells in the area and essentially warns that cell to protect itself against being invaded by viruses. So the cells in your body are very egalitarian that way. What they'll also do is they will signal the body to
Tim,
kind
can I
of
interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
So we're having a little technical difficulty with your audio, we think, and so people can't really hear. There's a little bit of scratch behind it. So what they're going to do is take you off. Chris and I are going to talk for a minute. We're going to bring you back in just a second and start you right where you were. Okay?
All right.
All right. So, going back to what Chris said, for all of the rest of us, because we're going to really, as you're already hearing from Jim, Dr. Rago's using his knowledge of microbiology and what he does, semester in and going into medical school. Back. And so,
How does the audio sound now?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that Jim and Nanci gave this presentation the very first week that the news about the virus, or maybe the second week that the news about the virus came out in China, or about it in China, and I'm sure it's much updated from that presentation, but at that time, there was interest in it for sure, and it was very topical.
Sure.
And it's one of the great things we can do as a university is to provide that kind of, I think we called it a pop-up, lecture or something like that when there is something going on in the country, that our range of faculty expertise that we have on so many broad range of topics allows us to just quickly educate ourselves or educate the rest of the community. And
right.
Jim and Nanci were really eager to do that then, and really generous to do that then. But as we've talked about, there's a lot more interest in it today
Oh.
than there was that first week. And so it's so great for them to be back and to be sharing it again in an updated format.
So I'm hearing that the sound is much better, Jim, and so we're going to
Sounds better now?
restart you back up.
Okay.
And get you back to the virus that's going to die and the virus that is going to live. That's where I left off. So
Right. Yeah, on the left you have the cell that's going to die. On the right you have the cell that's going to live. And thank the cell on the left for the warning.
Very dramatic.
And well, you weren't kidding, Chris. It seems like a lifetime ago when we did that talk. And I mean, I personally can't believe how much has changed since then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's almost like I don't want to say it was what we talked about then was rendered obsolete, but it's, you know, a lot of the things are still true, but a lot of things have changed quite a bit. And
yeah, it's been really interesting
yes.
to me as as somebody who watches the news and is trying to pay as close attention to this as possible, how much scientists have to report that they're learning things they didn't know before. You know, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and it's just really been interesting to watch research and science kind of happen in front of everyone's eyes like this. We don't usually get that kind of perspective.
and Jim, maybe
and
as
like
you
a lot
wrap
of what
up
I'm going to
today,
talk about.
you could say something
Right.
about that, because I do think many people on just around the country have this sense that once something is said in science, it's true forever. But the very nature of science
right.
is that we are constantly questioning ourselves, and the theory of today will be discarded for a better theory a month from now. And so, you know, as you wrap up, maybe you can speak a little bit to, you know, what things people are still investigating today about viruses and what they're learning.
Right, and you beat me to it. I was just about to say the same exact thing. I mean, science is by its very nature a self-correcting process, and if people are doing it objectively and with humility, then we can really advance knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
That's great.
But
So I think
And
we're
our
ready to
picture
keep
back?
going if the slide
There we
can
go.
come back, and yeah.
sure. So, and again, I was almost done with this slide anyway. But yeah, like I said, the cell on the left here is going to die, and it's warning its friend here next door that there's a virus in the area. Protect yourself. Under normal circumstances, the body would see this cell as self, which means it's okay, it's not going to get attacked. But the cell will kind of indirectly commit suicide and kind of rat itself out and say, you know, look, I'm a self cell. You'd be okay with me, immune system, but something has happened. I have something in me that is not self, something that's foreign, and I need to be destroyed. So essentially, it asks the immune system to come kill it. So we have the next slide. So, you know, in a basic sense, every virus as well, any life form for that matter, and the name of the game is multiply and spread. You want to make yourself as widespread on planet Earth as you possibly can. And that's kind of the motto for, I always tell this to my students, that's kind of the motto for Pathogen University: multiply and spread. Be fruitful and multiply, reach every corner of the planet if you can. And I think COVID has done that pretty successfully now. We have Signum Fidei, they have multiply and spread. So now, COVID, well, some coronavirus specifics. COVID is a member of this family. These are enveloped RNA viruses, so they have an RNA core and they have a pretty large genome. In fact, their genome is about 3 times the size of RNA viruses that are of clinical significance to humans. So not only does this have a lot of RNA, it's got a lot of genes, some of which we understand very well, whose products we understand very well, some of which we don't. And you can see here there are probably several coronaviruses that most people are familiar with. There was a outbreak of SARS in the Middle East in 2002, 2003. The signs and symptoms of the disease experienced there at the time were pretty similar to what most people are experiencing with COVID now. The key difference is this variant of COVID at the bottom there, SARS-CoV-2, otherwise known as COVID-19, has managed to multiply and spread much more effectively than its cousin, SARS-CoV-1, which is the SARS that's part of that first outbreak there. There was also an outbreak of Middle East respiratory system in 2012, 2016 in Middle East. Surprise there. Other parts of the world too. Again, Signs and symptoms of the disease were very similar to what you'd see with SARS, maybe not as severe, but it still managed to become pretty widespread in the world. And what a lot of people don't know is that, there are some coronaviruses out there that cause most of what we write off as common colds. Not many, but the likelihood of people in this country or anywhere having been exposed to a coronavirus of some kind at some point are pretty high. So these are pretty ubiquitous. But, SARS-CoV-19 is not. And that's kind of what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with a slight variant of the SARS virus that they experienced in Asia in 2002 and 2003. Next slide. So what you're kind of looking at, and I'm sure everybody's seen this picture on the news by this time, you're seeing kind of an outside scanning kind of cartoon depiction of what the coronavirus looks like. It's got a number of proteins on its surface. I'm going to talk in more detail about that S protein, that spike protein in detail, because that's a big part of what has made this virus so ubiquitous on the planet right now. And there are a couple of variants of this that are showing much greater ability to multiply and spread throughout the community. Get the next slide? So some COVID-19 specifics. This is, again, what they called SARS-CoV-2 for a while. I remember back in January or February when we did our talk, it was called 2019 nCoV. Now it's gotten some more names. This was first seen in a pneumonia outbreak in China in December of 2019. The virus has changed a little bit in certain parts of the world since then, but genetically, structurally, it's very similar to SARS-CoV-1, which is what caused that outbreak a little less than 20 years ago. What they're finding with the incubation period of this virus, and for those of you unfamiliar with that term, the incubation period of any pathogen is the time between when you're first exposed and you start showing signs and symptoms. Some pathogens might have very long incubation periods, like weeks. Others might have maybe just a couple days. But what they've found with COVID-19 so far, and this is kind of a compilation of what I've seen from a number of different sources, they're finding anywhere between 2 and 14 days could be an incubation period with a median of about 4 to 5. So probably closer to the 5 end of that spectrum. So on average, they say maybe around 5 days is the incubation period for SARS-CoV-2. And after about 11 and a half days, about 97.5% of infected patients will show signs and symptoms. Some might show very severe ones, some might show very mild signs and symptoms. But anytime you start showing signs and symptoms of any kind, incubation period's over. So the signs and symptoms after 11 and a half days are going to show up in most people. In fact, after 14 days, that's sufficient enough to identify greater than 99% of all cases, which is why you see that kind of 2-week threshold when you hear people talking about the amount of time people have to be in quarantine to make sure that they're not showing signs and symptoms. As far as the infectious dose goes, the infectious dose, the definition of that is kind of the threshold number of pathogens you need to be exposed to make you sick. Now, if you were just exposed to one single pathogen, one single virus, the likelihood of you getting sick is virtually zero. But every pathogen has an infectious dose. It has this kind of threshold number of friends it has to have with it if it's going to set up shop and cause disease. Now, I put a number of question marks after that because the consensus on this is still pretty unsettled. But for SARS-CoV-1, they found that about 1,000 viral particles is typically enough to do the trick. And the likelihood of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, being significantly different from that is not all that great. But again, I could be wrong on that. I could do this again in a few months and find that that's not the case. But I've seen a number of studies talking about SARS-CoV-2 saying that, yes, it's got an infectious dose similar to the other SARS. So 1,000 is not a terribly high infectious dose. That's on the low side. I mean, there are some viruses like hepatitis A and some of the cold viruses I was talking about who can do it with like single-digit numbers, which is pretty unusual, but it's a pretty low infectious dose. So this one, it's pretty average for most human viruses, maybe a little on the lower side. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a bit, and I think Nanci might touch on this too when she talks about some of the epidemiology. But outside of the human body, the half-life of this virus is about from 1 to 8 hours, with maybe a few outliers here and there. But after about 8 hours, the virus is pretty much non-viable, regardless of what kind of surface it's on, or if it's suspended in the air in an aerosol or something like that. So it's not going to last very long outside of a human host.
So Jim,
Get the next slide.
Could I ask you something quick?
Sure.
So
Sure, go
if you
ahead.
go back to the previous slide, John. In the middle, where you talk about, that you show symptoms in 4 to 5 days, and 97% of people show those symptoms. So when I hear all the time about asymptomatic people, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'd love to have you just explain to all of us, when we hear asymptomatic and you say everybody shows symptoms within, this time frame, how am I supposed to understand what they mean by asymptomatic?
Okay, the word literally means you're not showing signs and symptoms, but they have found that, and I was just looking at this about an hour before I came to talk to you, most studies have found that most people, in fact, the vast majority of people with COVID-19 will show signs and symptoms. They will at least show mild signs and symptoms. Now, it is possible, I've heard some studies as high as 25% of people being completely asymptomatic, which means no signs and symptoms. But the consensus seems to be it's not that high. So the vast majority of people will become symptomatic, either mildly or severely, within that time frame. Now, as the number of possible asymptomatic carriers gets higher, people get a little more afraid because they think there are people out there spreading this virus without even knowing it. And yes, that is a concern. It's not as large a concern as many people might think at this point. That could easily change at some point in the future, but that's essentially what that means. So it's going to be rare to find a person who's completely asymptomatic with this particular pathogen, but that is possible. And if you are completely asymptomatic with this, then that is going to increase the likelihood that you spread the pathogen to others if you're not taking the proper precautions.
Yeah, and I want to get to Nanci. But maybe as we go on, as you and Nanci talk later, the question that is still in my mind that you don't need to answer right now, but is then, it seems like we're working towards a vaccine, but it would be also valuable to work towards understanding these mild symptoms so we would know who actually had it, right? So we're taking temperatures, but that's that's only one of the things. So anyway, and I'll let you continue with the presentation, but those are the kinds of
there's nothing to say that mild signs and symptoms are necessarily indicative of COVID-19 either. I mean, at a time like this, when people are very afraid, they'll think, any cough or a sniffle is going to be COVID. So that's why that stresses the importance of testing and tracing, which Nanci's going to get into. Okay, and this is just a slide that I took from a study that talked about how viable SARS-CoV-1 and CoV-2 tend to be on many common surfaces. In aerosols, they can have a half-life of a day or so. Copper, a lot of heavy metals are strongly antimicrobial, so copper, I would imagine other heavy metals will be similar. SARS-CoV-1 actually seemed, in this study anyway, to be a little bit more likely to stay viable for a slightly longer period of time. Cardboard or other paper surfaces, they're finding that SARS-CoV-2 actually can remain viable for quite a bit longer than CoV-1 can. Stainless steel, that tends to support viability for a little bit longer, especially with CoV-2. And then on a plastic surface, you can get up to like 7 or 8 days. Did I just cut out on you?
No, we can still hear you, Jim. Jim, I think I can still hear you. Maybe we're having some technical difficulties behind the scenes here. Jim, can you hear me? No. Chris, as we're listening to what Jim is saying.
back.
I mean, any things that strike you in terms of, I don't know, new ideas, or I know you've heard this presentation a couple months ago, and we did this for people, but or questions that you feel like people
back,
might
John.
be having around this.
Okay.
Oh, there he is.
All right, you're
We're
back.
again.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Nope,
Sorry
what
for
happened there, but-
sorry for all this. Go ahead with.
Oh no,
there you
it's
go.
fine. So I was just going to ask you to go to the next slide. Thank you. So this spike protein I was talking about like I said, viruses are very picky about the host cells they infect, and the spike protein is structured such that it will bind to what's called the ACE2 receptor. That stands for angiotensin converting enzyme, which works on a molecule that helps regulate blood pressure and all sorts of things like that. You can find this receptor on all sorts of different kinds of cells, but it's especially prevalent on the cells that make up the respiratory tract. And what they found was and they're finding this more prevalently around the world now, a variant of that spike. Now, SARS-CoV-1, and they believe the original COVID-19 that they believe came from Wuhan, China, has what's called, the older D variant. But they've noticed, and there are a number of studies that are finding that this is the case. There's a mutation in this spike protein where one of the amino acids was changed from what's called aspartic acid to what's called glycine. It's the 614th amino acid in the protein. Now, without getting into a laborious discussion of biochemistry here, if you change an amino acid in a protein to the amino acid glycine, that can oftentimes result in pretty significant changes in the structure of the protein and how it behaves. So what they've found in this G variant, and again, this is the variant they're seeing pretty much everywhere around the world now, is that what happens is you get a 4 to 10-fold increase in viral load per patient. And what I mean by load is just the raw number of viruses you find in each patient. So you are seeing that this variant does cause the multiplication of more viruses per patient. Okay, so what does that mean for that person and for other people? Does the increase in viral load necessarily correlate with an increase in infectivity and the ability to spread? And what studies have found, at least at this preliminary stage, is yes, it does. In fact, many scientists hypothesize that it's this mutation that's allowed this virus to become as widespread as it has. I mean, more viruses per patient, more viruses grand total on planet Earth means greater likelihood of spread. So this is what has contributed, that has likely, or one of the things that could have contributed to the massive, rapid spread of this virus around the world. But that also begs another question. Does an increase in viral load per patient mean that that patient's going to experience more severe signs and symptoms? The answer to that question, at least what they've found at this preliminary stage, is no, it really doesn't. So an increased viral load in a patient doesn't necessarily mean that the disease is going to have more severe signs and symptoms. In fact, they're finding that it doesn't. So this mutation hasn't led to a more serious disease, but it has led to a greater ability to spread. And if you think about it from the virus's perspective, the virus, the name of the game is multiply and spread. It's not necessarily make a host horribly sick. They don't actively seek to make us as sick as they possibly can. They just want to multiply and spread. So this has worked to the virus's advantage from the virus's definition of success. At the next slide. And this is just the virus binding to the ACE2 receptor. The spike protein, the S protein, is what gives it the ability to do this. And this is what gives a virus its specificity for certain types of cells. And again, this variant, this D614G variant, apparently is giving this virus the ability to multiply in greater numbers, which is exactly what it wants. You got the next slide? And this is just kind of what's called a ribbon diagram of the protein, and it's showing where this mutation has happened. And like you can kind of see in this cartoon picture here, the G variant, the G614 variant, seems to have greater infectivity than the D614 variant, which is what they originally found back in December in China. You can go on to the next slide. I'm trying to speed things up for you here. So as far as treatments go, and again, I think Nanci will probably get into some of this too, all they really recommend for now is palliative care, just treating the patient's signs and symptoms without necessarily addressing the root cause. This is the only thing that, there is quite a bit of medical consensus on as far as how to treat a COVID patient, is just, can we make the person more comfortable? There have been a number of hypotheses out there that certain drugs like hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir will help with the progression of the disease. As far as hydroxychloroquine goes, I think the consensus in the medical community now is that it really has no effect on slowing the progression of the disease or alleviating signs and symptoms. Remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine is actually an anti-protozoan drug. It's a semisynthetic derivative of quinine, which is commonly used to both treat and prevent malaria and other protozoan illnesses. Remdesivir is actually an antiviral that they still do give, and they've found some success in giving these to only the critically ill patients. So a number of studies have shown that this is helpful, but only if you're, critically ill on a ventilator. If you've just got a, standard case or a mild case, this doesn't appear to help shorten the duration of the disease or alleviate signs and symptoms. In some cases, they might often use interferon supplementation. If you remember, that's a molecule that cells make to warn their friends that there's a virus in the area. And that can be given intravenously. It can be made in what's called a recombinant form and given to people to help them deal with viral illnesses. But again, I don't think enough studies have been done on whether interferon supplementation given with other drugs or just with basic supportive therapy is significantly helpful. And again, you've probably heard something about convalescent plasma, which is something, they call it IVIG sometimes, where they just give you an infusion of antibodies that were made by a patient who was already exposed. Like I said, they have shown in some people that has been helpful, but overall, the medical community, I don't think, has accepted that as a standard treatment. But in theory, it is helpful. And in some studies, it has been helpful. You can make use of antibodies that you didn't necessarily make yourself, and that can help neutralize the virus and help with the disease. And again, as far as vaccines go, if you're hoping for a positive answer from me on this, I honestly don't know. And the optimistic estimates that I've heard or seen say that probably at the beginning of next year. The more pessimistic estimates seem to say like a year or more. But like I said, Nancy's going to talk a little bit about something important called herd immunity, and getting a vaccine into the population is something that would really help with that. So with that, I can pass it off to Nanci.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think we will just go straight to Nanci. Since we've had a couple interruptions, we'll just keep moving on, and I have some questions following what Jim was just talking about, but Nanci may address them, and we'll come back to them if she doesn't.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, so...
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, please, Nanci.
Okay. Again, thank you for allowing us to give a little bit of insight. And as was spoken about, the talk that we did in end of, February, the problem there is we didn't have a lot of data. We didn't have a lot of information. We were going on some stories and things. So I'm going to concentrate a lot today of what we've learned related to data, especially how that's impacted us locally. So I thought this quote was kind of hit that point of when we are learning and we don't know specifics, and science does change as we learn new knowledge, we have to look at what is most probable, and that is what metrics and data is pointing to. So next slide. Okay, so public health strategies. Jim had mentioned the term epidemiology, and that is the study of what is happening to who, when, and where. And that's what we've been focusing on with communicable diseases such as COVID-19. And in that, we need to find out as much as we can about the virus. And to me, that is what's really amazing. Jim talked all about the microscopic information that has been gleaned about this new virus and how amazing it is that we've found so much about its genetic makeup and mutations and how it acts and how it's surprising people and sometimes not acting as we would think with coronavirus would. But we've learned a lot, and from that, by especially knowing its mode of transmission or how it's transmitted from the host, the person that's infected, to the next person that may become infected. That's really key in developing strategies, public health strategies. And that is what we have been doing over these last few months. And again, looking more, because as was mentioned before, we don't have control over this virus. We don't even have control over policy, or most of us don't. And so really looking specifically at what we've done here in Illinois and in Will County, I think will give us maybe a little pat on the back, maybe some confidence that we were doing the right thing and that it was leading us in the direction that we needed to do, to be in. So if we look at this graph, and so that whole idea of flattening the curve that we talked about, we really have done that here in Illinois. So the beginning of the graph shows in March, mid-March, the number of cases in Illinois, and then the last is from July 5th. So as you can see, our cases are have come down from the spike that we had middle of May. And that was really what was amazing here, is that's kind of what was projected on some of the models that we're following. And if you've looked at different models, you could take 10 different models and you'll see 10 different, very different stories. But one of the most useful one really did show that we were anticipating to spike in the middle of May and then come down on the curve, which we have. So our cases are higher than we would like, of course, but I don't think they're surprising. They're staying more stable. And of course, we're doing a lot more testing. So we're finding more of those asymptomatic folks, and then that difference between asymptomatic, where they don't recall any type of symptoms, which, as Jim said, it's allergy season. So sometimes it's hard to tell, was it a sore throat, a runny nose due to that, or was it a mild COVID symptom? Or sometimes people are pre-symptomatic when they're tested. So they may be going for the testing for whatever reason and are found to be positive and then end up a week later developing some symptoms. So our cases going up a little bit it's not all that surprising. Okay, next slide. The other important factor is our ability to care for those that are severely impacted by COVID, and helping to support individuals with that supportive palliative care, and finding out what really worked. There was a lot of new technologies, new things that we didn't do in hospitals before, how we position patients, when to and when not to intubate, or put a breathing device down somebody to put them on ventilation. There was a lot of lessons learned and studies and documentation, so that our care of individuals and our ability to have resources for them, that our hospitals, at the peak, were getting overloaded, and ICU floors were, pediatric ICU floors were turned into COVID floors. And so we were in Illinois, we were able to, handle that during that peak. But now that we are having less severe cases and being able to treat those individuals more successfully, our death rate is coming down quite substantially, as you can see. Okay, next slide. So a new term or new metric that you've been hearing a lot about, is this positivity rate. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But here in Illinois, we're under 3%. I think the last information I got was we're at 2.5 as a state, meaning of individuals that are tested, 2.5% of them are coming back as a positive test. So if 100 people are being tested, only 2.5 of them are positive. If you can go to the next slide, you can see where we've come with that. So this is our positivity rate. Again, a couple variables there because, of course, in the beginning, we were only testing people that were symptomatic or had some other high risk factor. So that's going to skew our numbers a little bit because more of the people that were being tested were positive. But you can see we're up near 25% positivity in April, throughout April. And so getting down to under 3% now to 2.5 is really a great feat. And that is part of the multi-faceted metrics that we look at of reopening and what types of things we base our kind of our safety net of, is it safe to change restrictions or allow events to occur.
Nancy?
Okay, next slide.
Nancy?
So that was, the previous slide was Illinois. This is the US positivity rate. And as you can see, back in April, all across the country, we were high, probably, this was skewed by New York and Chicago. We had, really high rates back in that time period. But then overall, the country started really coming down on positivity rates overall. As you can see, though, in the last few weeks, we're starting on an uphill curve there, which is not the way we want to go. And if you're keeping up with the news, a lot of that seems to be some of the states that were maybe slow to take on restrictions, didn't have testing capabilities, they don't have the mask mandate, whatever it might be, are seeing a resurgence of cases in those areas. So that is something we really need to be aware of. And I'll talk about some of the things that we're looking ahead of trying to get that positivity rate within the US and, of course, globally too, to flatten out. Next slide. So a really great source of information on a day-to-day basis is the Illinois Department of Public Health, their COVID statistics. There's really simple graphs, and you could look at what the 5-day rate is, because often when you look, sometimes there'll be a spike and then a decrease. When it's related to cases, often that has to do with cases that were tested on Friday and their results all come back on Tuesday. So Tuesdays always have a really high spike. So we always, looking over an average, a 5 to 7 day average, gives us a clearer picture of really what's going on. So this new addition to the IDPH, or Illinois Department of Public Health data site, is that you can pin down to your county to look at specific metrics of how your county is doing. And it's looking at how many new cases, what that test positivity percentage is, COVID-like illnesses, how many people they can call that. So that's would be now, flu, other types of illnesses before they're determined to be COVID positive. We're seeing less of that now. We're out of flu season, but that was more of an issue in the winter and spring. Something we're concerned about, though, as we go into fall and early winter with flu season coming back again. Then it looks at how many people were admitted to the hospital for these COVID-like illnesses, if there's clusters of positives. So we've seen that locally with some workplaces or within communities. So those are considered. The new deaths, the ICU availability within that county, and then the number of people that have been tested. So if we go to the next slide, this is pulling up, so this is what it would look like, and this is pulling up Will County's data. So the metric that we want to be at is less than 50 cases per 100,000. We're at 34, so it shows we're in target. It shows the number of deaths within the week and the test positivity. So you'll see in Will County, we're at 4.2, which is higher than our overall state average. Of course, we're a large state. We have some rural areas that have, no cases. I think there's only one county that hasn't registered a case, but many of the rural areas have very low positivity. So again, Will County had been a hotspot. for a while. It was Bolingbrook area had a number of clusters, and so testing was ramped up at the Will County Health Department in Bolingbrook in their satellite office, and that's what will continue to happen is where the need is, that's where testing will be brought so that can identify and help decrease the spread. And then the last metric, other metric is the number of tests performed. So the things that have helped, we're all familiar with. Hand hygiene. It's number one, important thing to do for any kind of infection control. And so washing hands. Sometimes the question comes up, hand washing, soap and water versus hand sanitizer. Actually, the good old soap and water is really the preferred method, but hand sanitizer is good to use when you can't get to soap and water. Doesn't have to be hot water. Cold water is fine. It's the mechanism of washing away anything that is on your hands. But it is the intensity, the rubbing of the hands, and at least 20 seconds under the water, making sure you get under your fingernails, between your fingers, up, over your wrists, and then drying properly. The limiting of group sizes. So when we talk a little bit of herd immunity, that's part of that idea of if the more people you get together, if the greater the percent or the likelihood that one of those individuals might be a carrier, may be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, or may know that they're sick and they're there anyways, and then could spread to all those individuals because they are susceptible. We don't have immunity to this and we don't have a vaccine yet. Mask use. So going back to the talk that we did in February, I remember that question kind of came up, and again, this was all new, and at that time, there was not a recommendation in the United States to wear masks. Part of that too was at that point, the masks we had were more of our medical supply masks, and those were already getting to be in short supply. And so now that we have options for other mask use, and that there does seem to be evidence, and anecdotally we could see that too from states that have mandated mask use to their ability to stop the spread. And that then, talking about the spread, what is still being looked at is the modes of transmission for COVID-19. The primary one is still thought to be respiratory droplets. And those are the viruses in larger respiratory secretions that come out when you would cough or sneeze or talk or sing. There is, though, the evidence that there is likely it could be aerosolized. So that means it's smaller particles that can travel longer distances. So droplet, usually it's within 3 feet. Aerosolized can be much greater than that, 6-9 feet. So our social distancing helps to maintain that distance so that we're not so close to people when they might be spewing these viruses out, along with the mask use. Enhanced surface cleaning, and so it doesn't have to be, there are EPA disinfectants for high-risk surfaces that are used in hospitals and other, professional cleaning, but just everyday cleaning of household surfaces, doorknobs, handles, anything that are touched frequently. And then our limit to travel, especially to higher risk areas. And now we've seen it kind of reversed. Now that we're doing better with our numbers, that we're asking individuals to reconsider coming to our area if they are in a higher risk area. And I believe now there is 15 states that Chicago, so it's just the city itself right now, that is asking individuals if they're coming into Chicago and staying in Chicago to quarantine for 14 days before they go out and do whatever they want to do in the city. So that can be, so it's really, really more educational, very hard to mandate and follow up on that, but it's putting it out there so people, if you're going to come to Chicago, maybe delay it. Another big part we've always, been testing and then following up with the positive case. But now what we're really looking at and what we need to do is surveillance. So finding out who is infected, whether they're symptomatic or not. So that's increased testing. And then when those individuals are found, to identify them, educate them, talk about isolation. So positive cases need to isolate, mean taking themselves out of, away from their family, being in a bedroom, hopefully having their own bathroom if they can, to really limit their contact with anybody else. But that now the next ring is the contact tracing. So who was that individual by the 2 days that they either before they were tested or became symptomatic? That's the key period for spreading the disease. And by contact, because, as we're starting to go about our business a little bit more, you pass hundreds of people a day, but really close contact is being within 6 feet of somebody for, depending on the site, 10 to 15 minutes of contact. So that close contact. Those individuals then would, the case would be asked to identify who those people would be. And the contact tracer, which would be from your county health department, would call those people and let them know that they're a contact of a positive case and ask them to quarantine. So the difference there is quarantining is you're limiting your movement. You're not going to the grocery store. You're, being extra careful. It's not the as strict as the isolation. The other area that we're, continuing on is the research and development of effective vaccines. And I put in there vaccines because we're likely going to have dozens, if not more, hopefully, available. And as Jim said, maybe we're doing really well on clinical trials. UIC or U of C, I forget which one, had started a pretty big clinical trial with, I think, 30,000 people. And so that's a good step. If that's a positive, then, maybe around Christmas, we might have something approved, but approved and available is really different. When you think about how many doses are required, they're going to have to start going to vulnerable populations, probably individuals in nursing homes, assisted livings, those that work there, healthcare providers. So even if we do have enough of the vaccine available, it's likely going to be until spring before we can, start getting that out to the general public. But it's been record speed that's being done. So the important thing, and I've heard some people say, well, I'm not going to get that vaccine. I'm going to wait till everybody else gets it. And, there's always concerns when there's something new we're putting into our body, but that's why we do these clinical trials and multi-levels of them. It brings up that idea of herd immunity. And we've been talking about herd immunity and COVID from the beginning, because I think it was the UK that said, let's just have everybody develop natural herd immunity. Let them all get exposed, and then it's going to stop the spread, which is true for a temporary, because we don't know how long the immunity lasts once you are infected. But as we saw, the number of, even with our restrained and our restrictions, the number of people that died and were severely impacted, and now we're hearing about other complications that are, happening to individuals and even populations that we didn't think were so vulnerable, there would have been a lot of disability and life lost trying to do it the natural way. With vaccination, the idea is there are going to be some people that can't get vaccinated for whatever reason. There's going to be people that don't build up immunity. That happens to us all the time. You might find you've gotten your measles shot and you go and you get a blood test drawn and they say, well, you're not immune to the measles. You didn't build up enough immunity, and that happens. So with herd immunity, if we can get everybody that can get vaccinated, that's going to protect the few that can't be, and the virus won't have hosts that it can jump to start a new life and spread further. So it's really important for all vaccinations that it's a public health effort, and that we all do our part in that. So I think I have one last slide, just kind of bringing it back to epidemiology. This is a quote I use in my class. Its methods may be scientific, but its objectives are often thoroughly human. As you can see with our public health efforts, we're all part of the public health community, and it really is all our responsibility to be accountable citizens and protect each other, protect ourselves, and help get rid of this virus. So thank you.
Thank you, Nanci and Jim. So I guess, we are running short-ish on time, but I did want to say just a couple quick things. One, so grateful that, this is what we do as a university, is constantly learn, and we have amazing faculty like the two of you who are able to offer your expertise. The way you ended yours, Nanci, I guess I just want to comment on it, because a lot of things that we've been talking about, Chris and I and the broader leadership team, is about creating a culture in which we take our Lasallian values and turn them towards this virus, which means that we act in a way to benefit others. And that is about the stuff you're saying, Nanci. Not everybody can get vaccinated, so I'll get vaccinated so we create a herd immunity. And we have so many alumni out there who are working in various areas, whether in hospital settings or on research that came out of the biology department and working on vaccines. But this notion that we as a community are going to be there for each other as we go through this is a really important thing that both of you, I think, have raised as we think about knowing more about it, and then how do we actually behave as people to try to protect others in the community that are more vulnerable. Chris, I don't know if you have questions or comments for Nanci or Jim.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment too, and I was thinking something very similar, based on that quote that Nanci ended with. It's just such a meaningful quote, especially for, the four of us here work with people all the time in our work, and I know we're also intimately aware of that, and I've just been much more conscious of it in the last 5 months than ever before, really, probably in my life. And it's so fascinating how this particular incident or this particular bit of science that we're taking in today, so much it's just such an illustration of how it corresponds, and everything corresponds with human life and human decision making, and groups of people understanding things together and learning together and making decisions together. It's just such a rich topic. Mm-hmm. Do we have time for some specific questions?
Sure.
I have at least
think you
one.
should. Let's take another. People can and may fall off, but we have these two experts with us. We might as well take an extra 10 minutes and ask them a couple questions.
And this isn't deeply related, but this is just something that's been in the news the last couple weeks. And so, Nanci, you said, I think, that the death rates going down a little bit are a result of better care or better palliative care, other measures and Jim went down that list of things that are being tried in hospital settings. And something that's been in the news a little bit has been theories about how that divergence of the death rate and the positivity rate might be because of mutations or just the evolution of the virus and so on. And I'm just wondering, it's really a question for both of you about if you've heard anything about that or if there's any validity to that. And I think Jim summarized that, that its primary desire is to spread, and it might be easier to spread if it's less detectable, I guess, is the theory behind that theory.
Well, Jim probably has some good comments related to the mutation. I guess from a public health perspective, another area is that we've really, a good percentage of our deaths have been in our really vulnerable populations in nursing homes. We've seen that in the Joliet area, just, sweeping through, affecting both the residents and staff there. And so we've really changed up how we are nursing homes, assisted living, any senior communal living is restricted. There's no visitors. They're testing their staff much more frequently. They're testing residents. They're isolating. So we've been more proactive in those really vulnerable populations that were having a very high fatality rate. So I think that's one of the areas. But Jim, anything? I haven't read anything on the mutation specifically.
Well, the only mutation that I talked about was that D614G mutation, and that's like many scientists hypothesize that that's what gave that virus the ability to spread as far and wide as it has. And then that kind of goes back to, like you were saying at the end of your part, the importance of herd immunity, because the more viruses there are on the planet, the greater the chances are for mutations that could come back and threaten even people who are already protected against the original pathogen. So again, anything you can do to minimize the number of viruses there are on the planet can and should be done, because that's going to limit the likelihood for mutations that could potentially come back and threaten other people.
Is there, Jim, just on that front, is there a typical, because I guess, what I'm most used to is the flu as something that we get a new vaccine every year because, and I don't know if that's because it is literally moved around the planet, like the flu virus that was, in Africa in 2018 becomes the flu virus that's in the United States in 2019, or if the flu virus mutates every year, and that's why we need. So, are we likely to see a COVID-19 mutated virus a year later that we will have to develop another vaccine for? And I guess my follow-up question on that is it easier to create the second vaccine once you have the first one?
Well, to the first part of the question, influenza just happens to be a virus that's very, very, very good at what they call antigenic variation. It's for a couple of different reasons. It's got some things working in its favor that SARS or any of the coronaviruses don't. And I'm not going to bore you with the specific details, but to kind of address the second part of your question, the likelihood that we would wind up with a mutant variant of COVID-19 that could potentially cause problems, I would say, is lower than it would be for something like influenza virus. Influenza virus wrote the book on antigenic variation and changing its surface spike proteins and such that it's a new version practically every year. But, and I think that if you've already got a COVID vaccine in the works, developing another one would not be as difficult as starting from square one or starting from scratch. But, it is something that obviously would need attention. So to sum up here, I guess you're right when you think that it's having something in the hopper already would be beneficial and would help in vaccine development in the future. But I don't think coronaviruses have the mutagenic potential that viruses like influenza do.
Thank you. Other questions that you have, Chris?
So I was just wondering, my last question would kind of be referencing back to the presentation you made in February. What has changed the most between then and now in terms of what we know or what you know, or what were you most wrong about, if I could ask that way?
Yes. I think I was most wrong about how serious and widespread this would become. I mean, it's easy to say this. We've seen all sorts of, panic over pandemics just blow over and wind up being nothing. But this happened to be, at least in my lifetime, one of the most widespread and potentially serious outbreaks of a disease I'd ever seen. I had no base of reference. So, I still think the advice we gave back then is solid. Mm-hmm. But I think all of us, myself included, underestimated the severity of what we were facing. And that's from the top down. I honestly, even with epidemiological experts, people in government in key decision-making positions, I don't think anybody saw the extent of what we were facing. Even with the best data in the world, this is new ground for a lot of us, even people who are the most experts in the world.
Nancy?
Yeah, I agree. And I've looked back at our comments, and yeah, we were trying to, at that point, preserve some calm, which, at that point, because we were just learning. And I think we still need to do that. We still need to keep our calm because that's how we think better. That's how we respond better. It's just like, as Jim said, it's much more, it really took hold. And I think I think had more confidence in that we were going to be able to spot the sick people and, get them off the street and quarantine. And,
Yeah.
I don't know that our early attempts of, bringing travelers in and not giving them guidance or surveillance. Again, we didn't have as much testing. There were a lot of things early on that we were missing that just allowed it to really spiral and get a foothold.
Right.
So,
And I think what we said at the end of that last presentation was, and I think this is true, there will be life after COVID. We will get through this. It's just a matter of, what sort of mess are we going to have to clean up as a result of it? But we will eventually, as a community, as a species, get through it.
yeah, and on that front, I mean, and just, I guess my last question, and then we'll, again, thank you one more time. But so on the whole learning front, again, we see these spikes all over the country. Nanci, you referenced that. Is there any data that would give us a leaning towards, kind of the likelihood that these spikes are just going to move around the country indefinitely until there's a vaccine? Or, Nanci, you talked about how Illinois, our curve looks a little better, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but does it seem more likely based on the science that we will see another spike in Illinois that's just inevitable? Or if we kind of play our cards right, we can stay at this kind of, it's not great, but it's a kind of steady, under 1,000 infections, under 50 deaths a day, this kind of average that, is still, it's horrible that 50 people are dying a day on average in Illinois. But I guess I don't know the science well enough to know whether this is just going to move around the country in terms of these spikes, or we can kind of do certain things that'll prevent that.
Well, my optimism tells us that as long as we continue to be vigilant, continue to watch the data and respond to it, if we start seeing, just as we've Chicago has done, there might have to be a backstop on restrictions or added restrictions. I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more availability of antibody testing, and put a plug out there for the local blood donation centers. Right now, if you donate blood at some centers, they will test your antibodies for you. So it's good to know. Again, we don't know how long that lasts, but it's a good just tool of how many people may have been infected and how widespread this may have been. If it's had infected 10 times more people than we thought, then maybe we are safe for a while of a resurgence because we have a bit of a herd immunity to get us over until the vaccine is there. But again, it's all science. We're learning every day. It's something we have to keep a handle on. We have to look at what has happened in countries that have been impacted before us. I think the states, I'm hoping that just like Chicago, Illinois and New York kind of had their month of terror, that, unfortunately, maybe these other states are going to have that, and then, are going to have to respond to it, and then hopefully start to flatten as we have also.
Thank you. Well, again, I just want to thank both of you. This has been fascinating, and I've been trying to keep up on it, and I learned a lot today. So thank you both for taking the time to be with us and your expertise and, the many, many decades of study that have led you to be where you are today and be able to share this knowledge with us.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with me again today, Chris. We're grateful for this opportunity. And a reminder, next week we will not have a conversation from Stritch, so we'll be back in 2 weeks. So Thank you to Nanci and Jim and everybody watching. I hope you have a great couple weeks, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for having me.